Excellent. I think I see quorum. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Built Heritage Subcommittee meeting of March 8th, 2022. I'd like to call the members to order. This meeting is being held remotely through Zoom. Those who do not need to participate in the meeting can also watch it live on the Ottawa City Council YouTube channel. Though this meeting is being held virtually, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which Ottawa is built is unceded Algonquin-Anishinaabe territory. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the people of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. The City of Ottawa honors the peoples and the land of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Nation, and the City of Ottawa honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable contributions to this land. As we progress with this meeting, I'd like to remind participants to please keep your microphones muted until I call upon you to speak. I will provide each committee member with the opportunity to ask questions or comment on each item in the order in which they raise their hand in Zoom. For panelists, the raise hand option is found at the bottom of the participants list. For those calling in, press *9 to raise your hand. The committee coordinator and I will be watching for those cues. Members are also reminded to submit any motions, visual supports, or declaration of interest in writing to the coordinator at their earliest opportunity. Although the deadlines have passed for residents to register to speak and provide written submissions to the subcommittee, residents may still make written submissions to the Planning Committee and Council. If you have technical difficulties signing into this meeting, you can contact the committee coordinator by calling 613-580-2424, extension 22953. A reminder that if participants are having technical issues with their Zoom connection, they may call in using the backup telephone number provided by the coordinator. In terms of regrets, I've received no regrets. Could the committee coordinator please call the roll? A reminder to members to unmute themselves when they're called.
Member Halsell?
Here.
Member Podolsky?
Here.
Councillor Gower?
Here.
Councillor McKenney?
Present.
Member Conforti?
Here.
Councillor Brockington?
Here.
Councillor Moffat?
Here.
Vice Chair Quinn?
Here.
Chair King?
Here.
You have quorum, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, are the minutes of Tuesday, February 8th, 2022 confirmed? Confirmed. So our first item deals with postponements and deferrals. Number one, the Heritage Watch List update. Can staff please provide an overview of this report?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'll just wait for the committee coordinator to get the slides up on the screen. Okay, thank you, Mr. Pillow. So today, this presentation was deferred from the February meeting. It's a presentation related to the information report on the Heritage Watch List. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the background of the watch list and then provide some detail about the individual buildings that are currently listed on the watch list. And I'm happy to answer any questions the committee members may have at the end. Next slide, please. So as a bit of background for members of the subcommittee who may not be familiar with the creation of the watch list, vacant and deteriorating heritage buildings and demolition by neglect have been long issues in heritage conservation in Ottawa and around Ontario. The issue puts significant pieces of the city's built heritage at risk, creates issues for neighbors who live nearby, and also broader public safety issues related to various types of building issues. So beginning in 2013, heritage planning staff worked with bylaw and regulatory services staff on the vacant building strategy. And one component of that strategy included updates to the city's property standards bylaw to include specific provisions related to the maintenance and conservation of designated heritage buildings. So in addition to the provisions that apply to all vacant buildings around the city, we also have provisions related to vacant heritage buildings in terms of ensuring that they are properly mothballed, protected, secured while they are vacant. After the new property standards bylaw came into force, heritage staff worked with bylaw staff on property standards issues related to heritage buildings, but it was on more of an ad hoc basis. In 2016, the mayor created the Heritage Matters Task Force, which was intended to put a focus on issues of demolition by neglect and vacant heritage buildings. The task force met 1 to 2 times per year and received updates from city staff on various issues. This task force was responsible for increases to the funding for the city's Heritage Grant Program and the creation of the Community Improvement Plan for Heritage, which offers a tax incentive for property owners to develop their heritage properties and undertake conservation or restoration work. Through the creation of the task force, the Heritage Watch List was formalized in 2016 after several years of collaboration between staff on vacant building issues. So the watch list is a collaboration between heritage planning staff, building code services staff, bylaw and regulatory services staff, as well as other required staff as needed. So legal staff are sometimes involved, or right-of-way staff who deal with encroachment issues. Staff monitor to monitor vacant, damage, and at-risk buildings in a systematic way. Next slide, please. So the watch list currently has 33 properties listed on it. 7 properties were removed in 2021 and 3 properties were added. And in terms of how we manage them, we triage them sort of by risk level, so low, medium, and high. Next slide, please. So properties are identified by complaint or by city staff. They must be designated under Part 4 or Part 5 of the Heritage Act in order to be added to the list. Properties that are simply listed on the register are not subject to the requirements of the property standards bylaw as it relates to heritage. So the team has developed an internal process for adding and removing properties. Generally, it will come, these complaints come either from members of the community associations. Sometimes heritage staff note these buildings when we're out and about. And so heritage staff conduct a site visit to confirm that the property is in poor condition and is vacant or threatened, and warrants monitoring through the watch list. Staff then work with the assigned property standards officer to identify areas of concern and attributes. The officer generally conducts his own site visit and works with heritage staff on orders as required. The internal team, so bylaw, building code, heritage, and the ward councillor are notified of the addition of the property to the list. Once the property owner has been contacted, the local community association is also notified that the property has been added, and the property and a photo of it are included on the city's website. In terms of removing the property from the list, there are some criteria. So for vacant buildings, the building has to have been renovated and is compliant with the property standards bylaw and occupied, or the building is demolished. And then for occupied buildings, of which there are very few on the list, the property standards issues related to the property have to be resolved, and the property has to be in compliance with the property standards bylaw. So the heritage planning staff and bylaw staff work together prior to the removal of a property from the list, and properties are only removed when they meet one of the criteria. And then the same process is followed in terms of notifying internal and external stakeholders about removing a property. And then the last bullet point on this slide is about a newer process that we've created about heritage attributes at risk. Because one of the things we found is that most of the buildings on the list are vacant and at risk of demolition by neglect. But there are also many buildings around the city where it might just be a porch, or it might just be some decorative masonry or some other individual heritage attribute that may be at risk of loss. So staff have developed a process for properties that may not be vacant but have attributes at risk. So the goal of the The goal of the process is to work with property owners to help them understand the importance of maintenance of heritage attributes, provide information about the city's Heritage Grant Program, and to provide conservation advice. So we start with that approach from the heritage planning side of things. If this approach is unsuccessful, heritage staff work with bylaw colleagues to issue orders under the property standards bylaw as required. Next slide, please. So just to provide you with an overview of the list, and then I'm going to go into the individual properties. So as I said, there's 33 properties on the list, and we sort of triage them by risk level. So we have 17 properties in our low risk category. These are generally properties that are being renovated or developed. They're vacant properties that are for sale, or they're mothballed properties that are in compliance with the property standards bylaw. The medium risk properties are those, there's 6 of them on the list right now. They require regular monitoring to ensure compliance with the property standards bylaw and building code compliance. The high risk properties are the more problematic buildings, require regular monitoring and orders and enforcement. Some of the more difficult properties fall into this category. And then we also have a category for foreign owned or diplomatic properties because they require a slightly different approach. So we have 7 properties on the list that fall into this category. And the enforcement of orders on these properties is more challenging simply because the process requires liaison with the city's protocol office and Global Affairs Canada. And it is difficult to enforce any orders on these properties if the property owner is not willing to work with us. Next slide, please. So to start with the low risk properties, I'm going to go very briefly through these ones because, as I said, these are ones where they're properly mothballed or we haven't been issuing orders on them. So 66 Bradford Street is a Part 4 individually designated building in Britannia. It's vacant but in good condition. 590 Broadview is the former Broadview Public School, again designated under Part 4, vacant but well protected. 70 Nicholas Street is the former City Registry Office, also individually designated. It is vacant, but there is a redevelopment proposal that has been submitted. An application is expected to be before the committee this year. 70 Richmond Road is the Champlain Oil Service Station. Again, individually designated. It is vacant, but a redevelopment proposal has been submitted. Same piece. The application is expected to be before the committee this year. 21 Withdrawal Avenue, individually designated, vacant. There's ongoing development on this site. 460 Wellington Avenue. This is one of the few, sorry, it's Withdrawal Street as well. This is one of the few properties on the list that is occupied. It was added to the list as a result of some work that was conducted without a heritage permit, and the city is working with the owner towards compliance on that property standards issue. And then 40 Littleton Gardens is a building in the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District that is vacant, but there are no concerns with it at the moment. Next slide, please. Continuing on, the low risk properties, 35 William Street is located in the Byward Market Heritage Conservation District. You may remember this property. It was destroyed by fire. The committee and council have approved applications for the site for redevelopment, including a grant through the community improvement plan for heritage. 179 Geeg is in the Lower Town West Heritage Conservation District. It's vacant. There are no outstanding issues. The same goes for 143 Murray. 135 Barrett Street is the former St. Charles Church at the corner of Barrett and Beechwood, sorry. And it is part of the St. Charles Market redevelopment project that is ongoing. Next slide, please. 7 Crescent Road is in the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District. There are no outstanding issues on this one. We understand that it has recently been sold, so hopefully will be occupied soon. 79 Geeg, the same applies here. This is in the Lower Town West Heritage Conservation District. No outstanding issues at the moment. 197-201 Wilbrod Street. These are long-term problem properties. However, they have recently been sold and the new owner has submitted an application to demolish and construct a new low-rise apartment building. So the application is intended to be before the committee in the coming months. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight a couple of properties here where we've had some success, where these properties have moved from, let's say, the high-risk category to the low-risk category. So this building, the Boyd Farmhouse in Stittsville, is a Part 4 property. It was designated in 2012. It was allowed to continue to deteriorate for many years. Its isolated location and the vacancy made it susceptible to break-ins, vandalisms, fires, etc. The city was consistently issuing property standards orders for board up, fencing, broken windows, protection of the building and security. The property was sold in 2019 and the new owners have appropriately mothballed the building, secured it until the the overall property is ready for development. So the property is a good example of how the watch list works, and that a vacant property with the right owner can be appropriately conserved while waiting for a new use. This property has moved from the high risk category to the low risk category. Next slide, please. This is another example, the Bradley Craig farmhouse and barn, also in Councillor Gower's ward at 590 Hazeldean Road. So the farmhouse and barn are designated under Part 4 as a complex, and some members of the committee may remember that there was an application to demolish and move the barn some years ago that was never followed through on. Over the years, there have been some property standards issues related to the barn itself, but the owner of the property has worked very hard over the past 2 years, I will say, on restoration and conservation work on the barn. So all of the stone masonry has been repointed on the barn. The main issue was related to the sill beam and some significant rot in the sill beam of the barn. So that has been replaced in working with heritage conservation experts. And now they have moved on to doing some work on the house itself. So there were water issues in the basement. So there's various waterproofing work happening. There are no projected future use for these buildings yet, but it is anticipated that in the coming years there will be an adaptive reuse. But in the meantime, they are being restored and conserved so that when a use comes along, they'll be ready. So kudos to the property owner, which is Richcraft on this property, for working so well with city staff on the conservation work. Next slide, please. So the medium risk properties. So as I said, these are properties that, you know, are not at imminent danger of collapse or requiring ongoing enforcement, but they do require ongoing monitoring. And there are issues related to property standards for these properties. So the first is 30 James Street. This is a building in the Centertown Heritage Conservation District. It's listed in the medium risk categories. There are ongoing property standards issues with the property. The building is vacant. Staff are unaware of any serious proposal for redevelopment. 325 Elgin Street, you may remember this property from last year. It's a Part 5 building in the Minto Park Heritage Conservation District, St. Mark's Church. It's been vacant since the pandemic, and there are significant structural issues with the tower. As you can see in the photo, it's been braced. The tower is stable for now, and we are working with the applicant on a path forward for its conservation. Next slide, please. 114 Richmond Road is the Sisters of the Visitation Convent, designated under Part 4 of the Act. It does remain vacant. It has been vacant since approximately 2010. A heritage permit was issued in 2018 to demolish a portion of the building and construct an addition to the building as well. There was an Associated Planning Act application as well, where staff included a holding provision related to the conservation of the building. The heritage permit expired in 2021 and no construction has occurred. So staff continue to monitor this building, but there does not seem to be any real movement. 1119 Wellington, again, committee members will be familiar with this. Individually designated building, the Mcgill House, suffered a partial collapse in the summer of 2018. The property is stabilized and the city continues to monitor its condition. The property was for sale in 2021, but no longer appears to be on the market, and we're not sure if it has been sold or not. Next slide, please. 330 Gilmore Street. This is the former Board of Education building in the Centertown Heritage Conservation District. It's been vacant for many years. There was a development approved for a 9-story building by the Ontario Municipal Board. The property has remained vacant and subject to a variety of property standards orders over the years. There are currently no outstanding orders and staff are not aware of any intention to develop this site at this time. 323 Daly Avenue, the committee of course will be familiar with this from last month. The demolition permit for this property will be issued imminently, and once it has been issued, once the building is demolished, it will be removed from the list. Next slide, please. So we have 3 properties in our high risk category. The first is this property in the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District at 1 Maple Lane and 1112 Lisgar Road. It is a semi-detached house in Rockcliffe. The property owner wishes to demolish this building and has submitted 2 engineering reports which recommend demolition of the building related to its condition. It was vacant for many years and then sold to a new owner who is now proposing demolition. Staff are currently reviewing the potential demolition, and will work with the owner and the community association on a path forward. Any application to demolish this building would require the approval of committee and council under the Ontario Heritage Act. There are no outstanding property standards issues on this property at this time. Next slide. Somerset House at 352 Somerset Street West has been vacant and deteriorating since a partial collapse in 2007 and is, as members will know, one of the most difficult buildings on this list. So there is an outstanding 2018 property standards order related to the conservation of the heritage attributes of this building. The owner has been charged with non-compliance with the order, and that matter remains before the courts. Hearings have been delayed several times during the pandemic, and the owner has been in non-compliance for 2 years. City staff are currently working collaboratively on an approach to enforce these orders in the coming months, including the possibility of the city undertaking the work and charging the owner through the tax roll. The building, in the meantime, the building continues to deteriorate, and the property owner submitted engineering reports to Building Code Services in late 2021, advising that the building was unsafe and needed to be demolished. The city had a peer review of these reports undertaken by an engineer who specializes in heritage buildings. The peer review found that while there were several urgent items that needed to be addressed, the building did not require immediate demolition. Orders were issued under the Building Code Act requiring both immediate and short-term structural stabilization measures to ensure public safety, and the department will be monitoring the building for compliance with these orders in the coming months. In addition to all of these issues, staff in Heritage Planning and Planning Services are also in discussions with the property owner regarding the potential development of this site. Next slide, please. Our Lady School at 287 Cumberland Street in the Lower Town West Heritage Conservation District. The remaining walls of the school continue to deteriorate since the partial demolition of the building. The property was sold to a new property owner in 2019 and was listed for sale again in 2021. However, the property no longer appears to be on the market. Building Code Services issued orders in March 2021 related to evaluating the structural stability of the remaining structure, the bracing, and the overhead protection on the sidewalk along Murray. The owner is in non-compliance with these orders and may be charged under the Building Code Act. The owner is also in non-compliance with the city's encroachment bylaw related to the overhead encroachment. No permits have been obtained and fees for previous permits are outstanding. City staff continue to work collaboratively on an approach to bring this property into compliance and encourage the adaptive reuse of the remaining walls of this building and its redevelopment and the redevelopment of the site. As you can see, this is a very challenging property in a difficult, challenging streetscape, and we're really trying to work hard to move this one forward. Next slide, please. And then the final category, as I mentioned, are diplomatic and foreign-owned properties. So while there are many, many designated properties around the city that serve as embassies, high commissions, and official residences that are kept in fantastic shape, and these buildings often make great embassies and high commissions because they tend to be large, older houses. There are 7 properties on the list that have diplomatic status or are owned by foreign governments that are vacant and at risk. So as noted in the staff report, the diplomatic status or foreign ownership makes enforcement difficult, as all correspondence and actions must be channeled through an additional process managed by Global Affairs Canada. I'm going to provide a brief overview of these properties, but I won't be providing information around ownership due to potential security issues. So 231 Coburg Street is within the Sandy Hill, HCD in Sandy Hill. It was approved for demolition in 2018, and the heritage permit remains valid. 235 Mariposa is in Rockcliffe Park. Same, a heritage alteration permit was approved in 2020, and it remains valid. 58 Glebe Avenue is in the Clemo Estate East HCD. It's vacant. Staff in particular are trying to work with the owner on repair of the existing porch, which is in quite poor condition. Next slide, please. 38 Blackburn is in the Russell Range Heritage Conservation District. There are no outstanding orders, but the property is vacant. 46 Cartier Street, just near City Hall, has been vacant for many years. It is an individually designated building. There are no outstanding orders. And then 190 Lansdowne Road is also in the Rockcliffe Park HCD, and it was recently for sale, and staff have received some inquiries about the property, but it is unclear if it has been sold or if it remains under foreign ownership at this time. Next slide, please. I wanted to provide a brief overview of perhaps a good news story from the watch list as well. 187 Lansdowne Road, this property is in the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District, has been at high risk for many, many years. It's been vacant for over 25 years. The owners applied to demolish it in 2012 and were refused by City Council. City staff have been consistently monitoring the property, encouraging repair and restoration. The owner has now applied for a major renovation project that includes repair, restoration of the building, the grounds, construction of a small addition, a new security fence, because if you are familiar with this property, the existing fence is quite inhospitable, let's say, and a detached carport. So the permit for this work was just recently issued by staff, and we're hopeful that this project is going to move forward in short order. This one has been particularly difficult, and I think Chair King can speak to this as well, for the property owners who live nearby. I think it's been a challenging property to live next to or across the street from. So we're very encouraged by this action and hope that, that this will move forward quickly. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So just to highlight some of the new tools we're working on. So while there are some limitations to the watch list, we have had some successes. Heritage planning staff have been collaborating with other colleagues around the city on other initiatives to bolster and support the efforts of the watch list. So the first being the Vacant Building Strategy Update 2022. So this is staff in emergency and protective services are currently undertaking a review of the 2013 Vacant Building Strategy. So the review is looking at potential additional options to address noncompliance with property standards orders. So Heritage Planning staff are working with our colleagues to determine whether or not there are additional measures related to heritage that should be implemented through an updated report that is expected to be before committee and council in the spring of this year. The vacant residential unit tax, you may have heard of this. It was recently approved by council in 2021. The proposed residential vacant unit tax will levy a 1% tax on the assessed value of vacant units citywide. So there was a recent report about sort of the final implementation of this, and it's intended to be implemented in 2022, with billing expected to begin in 2023. Enforcement strategy. City staff in the Heritage Planning Branch are going to be developing an internal enforcement strategy for issues under the Ontario Heritage Act in 2022. And the strategy is intended to complement the watch list, the attributes at risk procedures, and the other initiatives that we've outlined above. It's going to focus on encouraging compliance with the Ontario Heritage Act and provide new processes and procedures for enforcement action when an owner is not in compliance. So we will collaborate with our colleagues in building code services, legal services, and bylaw services on this approach. And then the final piece, it's not totally new to this committee, is the CIP program. We're using it more as a negotiation tool to try to encourage some action on these properties. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions the committee may have on specific properties as to the best of my ability. I also have colleagues from building code and bylaw services here as well, if there are specific questions for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for the extremely detailed report. Really appreciate it. On this file, we did not receive any correspondence, and there are no speakers who are registered. So I do see a number of hands raised, and we can start in order with Councillor McKinney.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks staff for the update. questions about Somerset House, of course, what I feel most egregious example of heritage neglect in this city. So I know that we don't have control over court dates and then be pushed off, especially in and around COVID. And I know that the owner of this building has made several futile attempts over the last, I guess it's how many years now, well over a decade, to keep pulling us around as a city, keeping us at bay and pulling us around by our noses, really, and kind of making a mockery of City Hall, really, in terms of the applications and the plans for this property. So I guess, I mean, I'm on record as saying I believe that this property should be expropriated. At some point, I or someone else will bring that motion and we will have that discussion because it is a key intersection in our downtown, and it is a building that is worth saving. And I don't believe that it would in the end cost us money. I think that we could do what any developer could do with it and turn it around and actually make, if not a significant economic profit from it, certainly a social profit from it. You know, I see development going in there. I see, you know, private market housing, affordable housing, perhaps a branch library. There's so much potential for that corner and for that property. But further to that this morning, I just wonder if you have a sense. I know that we have orders on non-compliant orders, and it is still working its way through the court system. And at some point, I believe that we need to, at the very least, put a lien on the heritage attributes here and charge that back through the property tax roll. Do you have a sense in terms of timing on where we are at in terms of hearing the case through of non-compliance through the courts?
Thank you, Councillor. I don't have the exact date. As I said, it has been deferred many times. I'm not sure if Jennifer has that date, Jennifer Thurkelson from Bylaw. But what I will say is that internally, we're trying to take an approach of kind of a multi-pronged strategy where we're looking at that's working its way through the system. There are also the building code issues that are now in the system as of late last year. There is the planning process. So we're not putting one thing aside to work. We're not saying, oh, well, we're talking about a development, so we're going to put the rest of this aside for now. We're saying, okay, we're talking about a development, that's one thing, but that might take ages, and it has taken, you know, we've seen applications before that have not come to anything. So we're working in good faith with the applicant towards a development if that's what they wish to do. But at the same time, we're still trying to work through the other pieces. Jennifer, I don't know, do you have that? Are you aware of the date for the next hearing? Or Roger, sorry, Roger.
Sorry, just trying to get off mute here. Yeah, maybe I can take that one. So I don't know if I see Christine Entes on from legal, and she may be able to jump in here and provide some more context around, you know, the reason for delays with prosecution. But some of the challenges during COVID is, you know, the courts have been closed. You know, there's been some online virtual trials that have occurred, but certainly that slowed the process of getting these charges before the courts. This one here, as Leslie has mentioned, has been deferred a few times or adjourned a few times. We don't have a trial date at this point for the charges to proceed. But I think what's important to mention here is that it's the charges are separate from the actual order. So the order, we do have a confirmed order. So the property owner did not appeal the order, and the order is confirmed. We have charged them for failure to comply with that confirmed order. And we'd like to see the prosecution proceed prior to contracting out the repairs, just because of the significant cost. But that's not to say that, if this is delayed any further, that we wouldn't go ahead and contract out the work. We could do that at this point.
And just on that, on contracting out the work, which is what I want to see happen, we would contract it out and then it would be recovered through the property tax base account, right? Is that essentially how the process would work?
Yes,
we wouldn't have to go to court. Here's what I'm going to ask. Sorry to cut you off, Roger, but just so I don't have to ask two questions, to ask you one. We don't have to go back to court then to say this is why we're doing it. We can move ahead with those repairs and then charge it back through the property tax roll. Correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that's absolutely correct. So they're two very independent or very different processes. So the court process is separate from contracting out. So once we have the confirmed order under the legislation, we could proceed with contracting out and bill any of those costs back to the property owner through the property tax.
And what does it take for us to get that order? Like, I'm just trying to think of what are the steps to get there?
Well, I mean, there's several things that are happening right now. As Leslie mentioned, There is a redevelopment plan. There's discussions that are going on with the property owner, and obviously, compliance is ultimately our goal here. But the easiest route to this is to have the property owner undertake the redevelopment himself. But at the same time, we're working on what it would be to redevelop the property, or at least to address the preservation of the heritage attributes. So, but we're really concerned about scope creep on this one, given that we don't know what we're going to find when we start peeling back layers of this structure. So that's part of the concern. So I mean, this could escalate to I don't think it's unreasonable to say that it may be a $500,000 work to contract this out. So that is a concern.
But that would get repaid to the city. It's not enough, right?
Correct. There's always risks, obviously, but that's certainly, we have the legislative authority to charge those costs back by property tax.
Right. And if the property tax is not paid as a result, then eventually that would fall into the lien would be on the property. We would recover that. Is that correct?
Yes. So sorry, through you, Chair. It's those costs are billed back. There are priorities when the property is sold. Property tax, outstanding property taxes are a high priority. Christine Ent is on the call from legal. I wonder if she can jump in here just to help me here with how these are paid out as priority when a property is sold.
Mr. Chair, I apologize. This is not my fault, my file. And so if there are detailed answers that are required, certainly I can undertake to bring them back to Stuart Huxley and have him provide some detail on the specifics around the timing and issues. In terms of the priority on a sale when it's paid out, as Bylaw Services has indicated, certainly property taxes are a lien. They are a priority lien on the property, and they must be satisfied prior to, prior to conveyance. In terms of a tax sale, if that is the next question, the city does have the ability to and the authority to move forward on a tax sale after a certain period of time if property taxes have not been paid to the city. That is a separate process in and of itself. And I don't know where we are in terms of timing and liens on this property, but I will also take that back to the respective group and get a status update on that as well.
Okay, I appreciate that. I wouldn't mind a status update on that and start to consider how we move forward. This is an embarrassment really to the city. Again, it is making a mockery of all of our heritage rules and values, and it really, it really doesn't. There's absolutely no confidence that this present owner is ever going to do anything substantive with this property. It just doesn't make any sense at all to continue dragging our feet on it. So I'll look forward to just receiving that back, and then we can decide then how to move forward.
I can further advise, Mr. Chair, that I've just been notified that, as Bylaw Services said, they're adjourning until the court can set a trial date, but the next appearance is set down for next Thursday. So we will have more information by the end of next week.
Oh, okay, excellent. It's good to know. I'll wait till the end of that. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Appreciate that question. Now, Member Hassel.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Leslie, for such a detailed presentation. I couldn't help but notice our little church down on Elgin. When we last saw that coming through the committee, their plan was actually to take down that spire. They claimed they could afford it, and that's why the city had registered a mechanism on title. But you had mentioned that they're now working to conserve it. So did that mechanism assist in perhaps changing some minds, or it just seems as though that's developed quite quickly since we last saw it. So what's the update there?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. I think this one's a bit of a funny one, because I think with the pandemic and, the church being closed and, all of the kind of financial issues around that, it's been a bit of a back and forth with the church. So we brought that report forward last summer based on what at the time we thought was an urgent requirement to dismantle the tower. It turns out that they were able to further stabilize it in order to retain it. And so they are working with a consultant now. We haven't had a lot of action on it, to be honest. It's been kind of a bit of a back and forth. We talk to them a little bit and then it goes silent for a few months. But for the time being, it's stable. And I think they're just trying to figure out what to do next. So I'm not sure that the approval and the mechanism, the registering it on title piece really changed anything, or if it was just like a combination of that plus some further study that allowed them to stabilize the tower more for a longer period of time. So, I mean, either way, I think it's good news, but hopefully we can get a more permanent solution in the near future.
Yeah, well, it's great to see it heading in the right direction so quickly after we last saw it. So
yeah,
that's fantastic. I couldn't help but notice as well, looking at the list more broadly and excluding those 7 embassy properties, because I know they're their own kettle of fish. It seems as though a fair number of the properties of concern are effectively being mothballed or held for development. That was essentially my take on the presentation. Leslie, I don't know if you're able to confirm if that is in fact a trend.
I would say it's a trend in the last couple of years. So many of the properties that have been on that list since its inception haven't had a lot of activity, but I would say in the last 2 years or so, we are seeing owners come in with development proposals to adapt these buildings to new uses and incorporate them. And most of the ones in the low risk category are in quite good shape and, are protected and monitored and all that sort of thing. So that is, I think, good news that we're starting to see. And I mean, I think as development occurs, these will fall off the list, and that'll be great. It'll be, less monitoring to undertake, and hopefully we don't continue. And hopefully by bolstering the other tools with the vacant unit tax and various other mechanisms, we won't see as many on the list. Like we won't see as many coming onto the list as we go forward. So.
Okay, yeah, that's great. My concern with some of these is that they were purchased by individuals hoping to develop them, and then are essentially sitting either for financing or for market conditions or for planning approval. But some of them, to your point, have been sitting for quite some time now. So I guess it sounds as though there is more of a shift that's occurred since the market started heating up.
It seems that way in the last couple of years.
Okay, well, that's good to know. It feeds into the rest of the planning around intensification and 15-minute communities. The other question I had was really Spring Valley. When you have all of these vacant buildings sitting on the watch list, some of which you said have been sitting for decades, how common is it to see them lost to fire like Dali or vandalism, or, you know, is that something that the city factors in on this list?
We haven't had a lot of losses through fire since the list has been created, but I would say over the years, there have been various losses related to a building being vacant. And so that was one of the reasons that in the property standards bylaw now, there is a section related to vacant heritage buildings that requires, you know, the pipes be drained and that sort of thing to sort of help to protect these buildings in the longer term. That was, you know, we were definitely worried about 173 Huntmar, the Boyd Farmhouse, because it's very isolated and it was being used for parties and people were breaking in and there were fires in there. And I, you know, up until recently, and I have to give kudos to our long-suffering bylaw officer, Dave Darling, who is really, really good at working with these property owners. And I think we were sort of convinced that that building would be lost, but a new owner and compliance with the orders has meant that it is protected and it is in good shape. So I don't know that it's a trend, but it is definitely something we think about.
Okay, well, great news on the Farmhouse. And then one final question, building off of Councillor McKenney's comments. When the city undertakes work and then charges the cost back on its property taxes, is this a mechanism that's being employed I wouldn't say widely, but essentially is this new ground or is it precedent for the city undertaking this?
I think I'd like to refer that question to either legal or bylaw.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I lost part of your question there. You froze up, but I think you're asking if we contract out on a regular basis. Is that what your question was?
Essentially, if it's been done before.
Yeah, so I mean, we contract out every day, so it's not, this isn't anything new. I mean, a lot of times it's, you know, very, you know, lower cost repairs, you know, we're talking in the $1,000 range. But when we get into where we think the, you know, the scope may extend beyond $100,000, that's where we, you know, it's always good to charge first and go through the court process first and obtain a conviction before proceeding with contracting out any repairs at significant costs.
Thank you so much. And that's all the questions. I'll let you go.
Thank you so much. And the next person with their hand up is Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to you and colleagues. For staff, I'd like to ask if the subcommittee could receive a memo from you that details what tools you have available at your disposal to get property owners to address back issues on heritage matters. As Councillor McKenney has stated, their frustration with how long the Somerset House issue has taken. But I'm just thinking with a provincial election coming this year and AMO going to be hosted in Ottawa in August, I think if there's some advocacy to be done by this municipality and others about providing additional tools or authority or power to cities to engage on this matter, let's first know what our staff have available. So I'm just wondering, is that possible? Could staff simply issue a memo that explains all the tools that they have available when working with a property owner to address heritage matters that are in deficiency?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's no problem. We can provide a summary memo with that information. I can work with colleagues in bylaw and building code and legal to make sure that we have all the right info.
Thank you. Does staff believe that municipalities should have greater tools to address backlog of heritage issues?
I I think that's a tough question to answer off the top of my head. I think under the Ontario Heritage Act, I would say enforcement is a challenge because it is a fairly cumbersome process. But what I think the city has done through the vacant building strategy and sort of the watch list work has been to try to go at it through other channels. So through the property standards process and through the Building Code Act. So I think we're getting there. I think we're still learning and you know, some of these problem, you know, high risk properties are just so difficult. And we always say, you know, we can't force a property owner to develop, but what we're trying to do, I think, is throw enough at them that it doesn't make sense not to develop or not to sell, or, you know, so trying to make it less hospitable to have a vacant property, a vacant heritage property in the city. So so we can provide that memo and perhaps also identify maybe where some of the gaps are as part of that memo to the committee.
All right, fair enough. I have other questions I'd like to pursue with staff, but in the interest of time, I'll do that outside of this meeting. Thank you for this report and update.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Councillor Brockington. The next person with their hand up is Member Podolsky.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Leslie, and your staff and colleagues in the property standards for being so diligent about this. It was actually satisfying to see how much effort is being put into it. I wish it was a lot less effort, but nevertheless, the work is very effective. I wanted to address one of the gaps that you know, has been brought to my attention, and that has to do with the Hintonburg pumping station. This is a property designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act in 1987. It's owned by the city, I understand, and it had a fire in '89, but it is not on the Heritage Watch List. And one of the things that has occurred to me is that I've always had questions about that from the public who have said, well, the city is doing a very good job trying to enforce the conservation and stabilization of our heritage portfolio, but it is not doing anything about the properties that the city itself owns and is neglecting. And so I think, would it help if the Built Heritage Subcommittee moved a motion to direct city staff to bring this property on the Heritage Watch List so that it could be monitored and inspected, just like all the other properties that we are asking the private sector and foreign governments to do? I know it's an awkward question because it implies a kind of a little bit of hypocrisy where we are very good at pointing to other people, but we're not really addressing the city's own portfolio where buildings are at risk. So I would like to advise for the best way that we can bring this one into the public light and act on it so that the city is able to stabilize at least until some new use is brought along for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Podolsky, for the question. You're correct. It is a gap perhaps in the list, so this building is not on the list. I will say that informally it is monitored regularly by our staff at Water Services and also by Heritage staff, and we have been working for many years towards trying to find a new use for this building. It is top of mind. I think perhaps the best thing to do is for us to take that away as a direction to look at the legal side of it in terms of how we enforce our bylaws on ourselves and that sort of thing. So I think if that's okay with you, that's what we could do, is take it away as a direction to look at whether or not it should be added to the watch list, and we can report back to the committee.
Yes, that would solve it. Thank you very much.
Appreciate that. And Barry, I know some people have told me that your volume is a little bit low. So in your next intervention, maybe just look into that. We want to be able to hear you fully. And of course, we want people who are watching on the YouTube channel to hear you fully. But I'm very happy both obviously with the memo that Councillor Brockington has requested and the direction that you're also seeking. So thank you so much for that. The next person with their hand raised is Member Conforti.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to echo some of my colleagues' comments and thank Leslie for your great presentation and your work and your staff's work. A few of my questions were already addressed, so that's great. One thing that's a little bit concerning is the number of diplomatic or foreign-owned properties on the list. Like that's quite significant. And I realize and understand the difficulty in enforcing anything on those properties, but I guess I'm curious to know what your discussions with Global Affairs Canada has been, and sort of what is their strategy there between the city and Global Affairs, sort of next steps, what can be done, and is there anything from a municipal point of view, like are there any tools that would help you from a municipal level, or is it really just in the hands of Global Affairs at this point?
I guess maybe what I will say to start is that the foreign-owned properties or diplomatic, I'm calling them foreign-owned because some of them no longer have diplomatic status, but they're owned by foreign governments. The properties on the list right now, to be honest, some of them are actually not all that problematic. They're just kind of empty, vacant. I think the issue is that some of the countries that own the properties have, let's say, much bigger issues going on in the world right now. And so this is not really a priority, or they may not have a presence in Canada right now. And so in those instances, it does become quite difficult to even have a contact person. So the way it works is basically that we go through our city's protocol office, and then they liaise through Global Affairs Canada, who then liaise with the owner. So I wouldn't say there's an overarching strategy, because I think everyone is different. But we do sort of have a bit of a strategy on each one, and work differently depending on who it is that we're dealing with. So I know that's a bit of a non-answer, but these ones are kind of complex, and there isn't a really straightforward one-size-fits-all approach. So we work with our Global Affairs colleagues, and they generally sort of say that there is an expectation that foreign like diplomatic missions follow the rules of the country that they're in, and so that is the expectation that Global Affairs pushes forward for us on our behalf. Yes, they push it forward on our behalf.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Chair, I did have one more question. I know, Leslie, you spoke at the beginning of the presentation of, how do these properties make it onto the list? And it's basically, staff observe something, or if there's sort of a request from the community or concern from the community. Is there any plan in the future to sort of formalize that process and sort of I know you guys are super busy, but is there any plan to sort of formalize that process and do more of a formal review, either biannual or something like that, where there's more of a, I guess, accountability for these properties, rather than just sort of, if somebody observes it or if somebody brings up a concern, then it makes it onto the list.
Yes, we recognize the sort of unevenness that the current approach may result in, us missing some buildings that aren't on the list, as Member Podolsky just raised, one of our own buildings. We don't have the capacity, and I know not to speak for my colleagues in other departments, but I know they don't have the capacity either to go out and look at every single heritage building in the city to determine whether or not it's vacant or at risk. So that said, I think we are exploring some opportunities through the new vacant buildings, through the review for the vacant building strategy. We're working with our colleagues to explore some other ways that we might deal with this issue. So for now, nothing formal, but we are looking at options through the vacant building strategy review.
Thanks, Leslie.
And thank you for those questions, especially around the foreign-owned diplomatic properties. That was a question I was going to ask to really, get a sense of the complexity, because as the ward councillor, I was getting a sense of the complexity of those files. So I think you've saved me a question here. So now we can move on to Councillor Gower.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick statement of thanks for Leslie and her Heritage staff team, and to Dave Darling on the enforcement side. I've been a member of the group that meets several times throughout the years. Been very impressed with the attention that these files get and some of the problem solving that happens in those meetings in the mayor's boardroom, or more recently by Zoom. Specifically on foreign-owned properties. I know this is something the mayor has brought up a number of times, and look for solutions with other levels of governments as well. But without this task force, without this watch list, I think a lot of these things would really fly under the radar. So this is incredibly important. I'm convinced that 173 Huntmar that Leslie mentioned in her presentation would probably not be standing today or salvageable if it was not for this watch list. And same with 590 Hazeldean Road, the barn at Bradley Craig Barn, it's at Bradley Craig Farm. It's because we have these eyes on it that it gets the attention that it does. We've moved from a reactive approach to protecting these buildings to a more proactive approach. So thank you to staff for the initiative and the ongoing monitoring of these properties. Thank you, Chair.
And thank you, Councillor Gower. I think that is definitely an excellent way to wrap up. I also want to thank staff, Heritage staff and bylaw staff, for all the work that they undertake, especially around these properties. We know that this demolition by neglect is, I think, the worst type of impact that we see around heritage files. And we know that there's been a tremendous amount of focus by both heritage staff, bylaw, and even we see the mayor's office holding a heritage task force talking about these challenges that are confronting the city. I really do appreciate the complexity of the files. Like I said, I had some insight into some of those complex files, especially around foreign owned properties in the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District, the challenges that they pose to not just staff in terms of the interplay with multiple levels of government, but also residents, who definitely want to ensure that the adjoining properties that they live next to are in good shape, especially if they are heritage properties. So a tremendous amount of work has been undertaken for this report. I know this report had been delayed numerous times, so I'm very pleased that it could come, and I hope that this could become at some point an annual occurrence where we get these updates, inform the public as to some of the challenging properties, inform the public as to some of the challenges that ward councillors are encountering on an ongoing basis, and really emphasize the fact that we need to see the proper preservation of these properties. So really appreciative of the efforts here, and thank you so much for this report. So is this report received? Received.
Yes.
Thank you. So this report is scheduled to be presented to council on March 23rd. The next item, and I guess the last substantive item on our agenda, is concerns planning, real estate, and economic development department right-of-way, heritage, and urban design services, and it concerns 50 the driveway. So can staff please provide an overview on this report?
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just wait for the coordinator to bring up the presentation for me. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, perfect.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yes, this item relates to 50 the driveway, and it's a bit different from our usual reports. It's a file that has been a long time coming and a complex one. So I hope the committee will indulge me a little bit of extra time as I go through some of the background and walk you through the approach we've taken and that we're proposing. My colleague, Andrew McCrate, has been the land use planner on the associated planning applications for this. And he's on the call this morning to answer some questions in case those come up for those. If we go to the next slide, this is the property at 50 the driveway. It's located at the eastern edge of Centretown in the Golden Triangle at the intersection of Lewis Street and the driveway, adjacent to the Queen Elizabeth driveway and of course the Rideau Canal World Heritage Site. The property contains a 2 to 3 story red brick and concrete office building that was purpose built as the headquarters for the Canadian Nurses Association between 1965 and 1966. If we go to the next slide. So this property is not currently listed on the Heritage Register or designated under the Heritage Act. It was first identified by the city's heritage consultant that was working on the Centretown Heritage Study back in 2020. And they recommended the property be listed on the register until there could be further study for potential Part 4 designation. But before the property could be listed, the city received a demolition permit application. And in response, staff initiated the designation process at the time. This committee may remember that a special built heritage subcommittee was called and then subsequently canceled when the city and the owner agreed to put both the demolition and the designation processes on hold to have some further conversations about the future of the property. If we go to the next slide. So since then, staff have been working with the applicant and with our internal colleagues, and the applicant has submitted applications for an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment to permit a 9-story apartment building on the site. And as I say, through the development review process, we've been working to conserve with our colleagues the cultural heritage value of the property, using the draft statement of value that was prepared when the designation process was started back in 2020, together with a very similar version that the applicant's heritage consultant prepared as well. The applicant has considered a number of iterations of the proposal with varying degrees of retention of the existing building, including complete demolition. So this proposal has come quite a long way, but it hasn't been without its challenges, I should say, and that includes the building itself. So if we go to the next slide, I've got a couple of images of the building. It's a modernist style office building with influences of brutalism seen in its irregular plan, its imposing use of concrete and brick, minimal fenestration, and very little ornamentation. The building has a 2-story and 3-story section, which sort of corresponds with a change in grade on the site, and it sort of slopes down to the south. On the next slide, these are a couple of more images from the northwest. So the building was, as I say, purpose built for the Canadian Nurses Association. It's an example of a Canadian women's organization that has played an important role in establishing legal rights for nurses, training programs, increased pay, and improved working conditions for its members. And over time, the building at 50 the driveway has become a physical representation of the CNA with its distinctive lantern tower in the shape of a nurse's cap, which itself is a symbol of nursing's origin, and the lantern carried by Florence Nightingale. Known as the Tower of Light, the concrete and glass lantern anchors the building's irregular form and provides functions as a skylight into the interior. However, it's at 6 meters in height, nearly 2 stories. The lantern presents a significant challenge for incorporation into a new building. If we go to the next slide, a bit of a context image here just to show where we are. So the building was designed by prominent local modernist architect, James Strutt. He was known for his interest in non-standard geometry, experimenting with structure, and using new and local materials. And in 50 The Driveway, this is exemplified in the building's irregular form, the heavy use of concrete and brick, its 2- and 3-story massing, which translates to several different levels on the interior of the building and many flights of stairs. So these elements also present challenges for finding an appropriate new use for the building. If we go to the next slide, I've got a site plan of the proposal. So as I mentioned, the applicant has submitted and is proceeding with official plan and zoning bylaw amendment applications for a new 9-story building that will incorporate important portions of the existing buildings that we identified in that draft statement of value, including the 2- and 3-story sections facing the canal, its east entrance, including the trapezoidal stair, and a portion of the north facade. And those sections are outlined in red on the site plan on the screen. These portions are to be deconstructed as outlined in the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement using different methods depending on how they were constructed, moved to the south of the site, and then reconstructed for incorporation into the base of the new building. So the windows, the concrete spandrels and caps, the entrance door and surrounds, and the exterior brick are to be reinstated. And depending on the condition of the elements, particularly such as the stairs, some of those may need to be repaired or replicated. If we go to the next slide, we can see some of the renderings provided by the applicant with the lantern component that will be also deconstructed and then relocated to the roof of the new building. I think the lantern has maybe been one of the most challenging aspects of this proposal, and the applicant did consider a number of options, proposing first to relocate it on the ground as a landscaping element, and then moved away from this as I think there were some concerns with that location. And staff, I would say, also had some concerns given that it would no longer be a part of the building in any way. And the other thing I wanted to just highlight in these renderings, you can see the new portion, the new construction of the building will be substantially set back from the reconstructed base. And then there's several other step backs sort of for the upper floors as well. And we worked really closely with our colleagues internally and the applicant as well on the massing of the new building and sculpting those step backs so that the retained portions would remain the focal point. So on the next slide, this is to outline the heritage approach here. We're recommending the following sort of steps. It's a two-step, kind of two-pronged process, which is intended to run alongside the development approvals. The first step of the process, the heritage process, is what is in front of committee today, and that's to enter into a heritage easement agreement and list the property on the heritage register. So like I say, this process is going to run concurrently and is running concurrently with the OPA and the zoning bylaw amendment so that they can be considered at planning committee together. And then the second process, which will be to finalize the terms of the easement and bring that forward to this committee and council at a later time so that that process can run concurrently with the required site plan approval once the detailed design has been finalized. So as part of this first step that's outlined in red on the screen, staff are recommending the easement be a requirement of a holding zone that would be applied to the property through the rezoning application. And that would only be lifted once the easement is approved by council. The listing on the register, as this committee knows, is a way to formally identify and recognize places of cultural heritage value. And it also serves as a monitoring tool. So we can add a flag to our internal permit system so we can work with our colleagues in building code services on any future permits for the development. So in staff's opinion, these two mechanisms will work together to ensure the conservation of the site. On the next slide, members of the community, maybe of the public who are on the call, wondering, what is a heritage easement agreement? Certainly, the city's primary tool for protecting cultural heritage resources is typically designation under Part 4. But a heritage easement agreement is another tool provided by the Act that affords the same benefits and protections. It works through an agreement with the city and the owner. So essentially it's a contract that says that both the city and the owner will be good stewards of the site and do good conservation work. So similarly to designation, the agreement would identify the site's cultural heritage values and specific elements to be protected and conserved in order to recognize and celebrate the site's histories. It can also include very detailed terms that would form part of a subsequent bylaw, and that would need to come back to committee and be passed by City Council. On the next slide, in terms of what will this heritage easement agreement do? Like I say, the contents and the terms of the easement haven't been finalized. But like I say, this is the first step in the process. But the general intent of the terms is to, outline and identify those heritage attributes, the important elements of the site, to require the implementation of the conservation approach that is outlined in the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement, and identify interpretation opportunities to highlight and tell the previously untold stories that the site represents. As it would be an agreement, this approach also means that both the city and the owner have clear expectations and understanding of what will be undertaken and how as part of this development. And the easement is intended to tie the plans for the proposal to the sites, which, if approved, will still need to be further refined as the project moves through the process to site plan. And just as an example, if we go to the next slide, the applicant is still working to refine some of the architectural treatment of the new construction, particularly at that northeast corner, to provide some improved integration with the reconstructed lantern at the roof. And so staff will continue to work with the applicant on this and finalizing the other terms before bringing the easement back through Built Heritage Subcommittee and Council. And if we go to the next slide, just to wrap up quickly, in conclusion, staff have worked over the course of more than a year with the applicant to ensure the cultural heritage value of the site and that it can be conserved as part of the proposed development. And by both listing the property on the register and entering into an easement, staff are of the opinion that this approach is a creative and innovative solution to many of the challenges of the site and the building itself, while also meeting the goals of heritage conservation as part of the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you for the detailed presentation, much appreciated. We did receive correspondence which was circulated to members of the subcommittee from both Heritage Ottawa and Strutt Foundation. And we do have a number of registered speakers, including obviously from the applicant. So we have Carl Bray and David Anderson, who've asked for 10 minutes combined to provide a presentation on this project. Just to note as well, for future questions, we also have a number of representatives from the applicant, including Barry Hobbin, Donna Dewar, and Michael Villeneuve, and Eric Forhan and Tim Chatter, who are representatives of the providing input from the perspective of the architects, as well as the association, the Canadian Nurses Association, and the planning consultants. So we have a number of people who will be available for questions. They will not be providing a presentation, but we will start with Carl Bray and David Anderson, who will provide a presentation together.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee members and members of the public. I'm going to be making the primary part of the presentation. I'm going to borrow a little bit of Mr. Anderson's time, but Mr. Anderson and I will be available to answer questions. Much of what Ms. Kim has provided you with will be covered in some degree in my following presentation. But what I'd like to say to start is that This has been a long process, as Ms. Kim has pointed out, and it has gone through several iterations. And I've been very pleased with the way in which city planning staff and city heritage staff have been able to work with me and with the consulting team to work forward on this particular project. So Mr. Pilot, could you start the slides, please? Next slide, please. So as this slide shows, it's very much a collaborative effort that this project has gone through. I joined the project in late 2020 and over the next year prepared my cultural heritage impact statement. And part of doing that was with heritage staff, as I mentioned, with city planning. There was a public meeting. I've also been able to have consultations with interest groups, Heritage Ottawa, the Strutt Foundation, etc. So many different voices have contributed to this, and centering it all is Hoban architects who've been able to try to take all these different comments and combine them into a coherent design. Next slide, please. This is a fascinating site. I've been in this business a long time, and this site is really, really rich in terms of its history, going right back to glacial times. But it started off as a creek, and that creek became a very valuable portion of the Rideau Canal construction because it created a large basin that became a part of the canal and made life a lot easier from digging the deep cut just to the north. So it was also the site of a little boatyard, Neville's Creek, and the Neville's steamboat operation. And so it went through several iterations. Once that part of the Golden Triangle started to develop, the creek was eventually filled in and development took place around it. And then as the driveway cultural landscape was developed, that edge became sort of a transition zone with the rest of the residential neighborhood. And a lot of industry was placed along there in various types. So you see an image here of the moving storage warehouse that was on the property for many, many years, along with a few remnants of the residential properties that was part of the Neville Boat Works. And because it had been developed in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it was a bit run down. And the city at the time wanted to improve its image of this whole area. And so the current building, the current property, was part of a city-led initiative to improve the appearance of this area, but also to put higher value uses in this particular part of the world. And what you see is a rendering from the time that the building was being constructed. Next, please. So what you have is, as has been described, a building in the modernist tradition with some brutalist influences. The architect really was quite innovative and had his own way of dealing with massing, with fenestration, etc. But I think it's fair to say that the building is the kind of thing that would fit more in a suburban setting. It really doesn't deal much with the urban context, or for that matter, with the driveway cultural landscape. It's quite inward looking. There aren't many windows. And really the element that stands out and relates to its broader surrounding is the lantern that sits on top. There was an addition put on in the 1980s in a slightly different style, perhaps more a little more postmodernist, but generally compatible with the original structure. But one thing I wanted to point out, in going back to the history of the property, is the building kind of sits in what was the former creek bed. So you have a two-story portion up on the top of the bank, and then it drops down another story into what would have been one side of the original creek. Next, please. So through the renovations, portions of the original building were removed to put the addition on, and you have what you find there today. So my job was to do a full evaluation based on Ontario Regulation 906. I also was able to dive into the archives and historical photographs and come up with the history of the property that I've just mentioned. And I was very lucky to have the city's preliminary evaluation of the property. And I'm pleased to say that what they concluded was pretty much what I concluded. So we were in accord in terms of what the Statement of Cultural Heritage Value or Interest was saying and what the list of key attributes were. Next slide, please. So the key elements of the statement are, as you see here. The building, as I mentioned, has been slightly modified, and you'll see this in upcoming slides. But the importance is not just in terms of its exterior appearance, but also its associations with the nurses. It's a bespoke building. It was built specifically for them. It was meant to represent them. So in some ways, its legacy is that of the nurses more so than an individual architectural item. It's also, of course, a landmark on the driveway, primarily because of the lantern. There's a lot of tree screening between it and the walkway, but the lantern does quite stand out. Next, please. So these are the heritage attributes that have been mutually agreed upon. As you can see, particularly in the illustrations, the building is built on multiple levels. It does have a very irregular massing. It's also somewhat of a Janus-faced or two-faced building. So the rear elevation is very similar to the main elevation that you see from the driveway. But I think it's fair to say through discussions with staff and also hearing comments from the public and from the interest groups, the key attribute really is the lantern. And that's one of the reasons why there's been so much discussion on how to incorporate it into a new structure. Otherwise, the components, as you can see here, are elements that can be reconstructed and or replicated. Next, please. And as was mentioned in Ms. Kim's presentation, this is a quirky building, built very much for a single user and very much in a particular tradition that places heavy reliance on very thick concrete construction, a lot of masses of masonry, that kind of thing. And its location right in the middle of the property makes it very, very problematic in terms of how you would develop the site. That and the fact that it really does turn its back on the neighborhood and even on the driveway. It is adjacent to NCC property on the driveway and is near to the World Heritage Site. Next, please. So, although standard heritage conservation practice would be to seek an adaptive reuse for this building, my understanding was that just about all the avenues along that line had been pursued by the client before the decision was made to redevelop the property in its current form. So then it becomes an issue of how do you conserve the key heritage attributes? And going back to a list of those attributes, really they come down to the lantern and to what you see from the driveway. So the 2- and 3-story elevation, the trapezoidal stair, the fenestration, and some of the concrete detailing, such as it is. Keeping in mind that there have been some modifications to the elevation over time with new interventions in forms of windows and entrance stairs. So the approach is one that is within heritage conservation practice. It's perhaps not all that usual, but it does conserve the heritage attributes. It is a deconstruct, reconstruct. So taking portions of the existing elevation apart, storing them off-site, rebuilding them in a slightly different location, but within the podium base of the new structure, and in a prominent location, as was mentioned before, with the setbacks of the new structure behind. The prominence of these elements is going to be conserved visually from the driveway, but also in terms of contrasting with the rest of the new building. And the salvaged materials will be reused. They will be stored off-site. In some cases, replication will be needed for the stairs and for the terrace. But one of the big things that's interesting here is that with the redevelopment of the property, you get the opportunity to interpret the very rich history of the site and to some extent its immediate surroundings. So that's something that's very much part and parcel of this development proposal. Next slide, please. So you've already seen some of these, but this is just kind of a summary of what is being conserved and how and where it's being located. So the landmark element on the roof, which won't be publicly accessible, but will be visually accessible, internally lit, and very much a skyline element. And because it would be atop a 9-story structure rather than atop a 2-story structure, it will be that much more prominent in the immediate area and beyond. The facade will form part of a new interior residential units. The lowest floor of the 3-story unit will be the face of a portion of the underground parking structure, but otherwise the fenestration will lead into interior spaces. And there will also be a lobby in the new tower where interpretive possibilities occur. As well, we have there are interpretive opportunities along the Lewis Street side where it's immediately publicly accessible. Next slide, please.
And Carl, just wanted you to know that you are a bit over time.
Okay, this is the last slide. Thank you. So just in summary, going back to the standards and guidelines, a deconstruct, reconstruct can be considered a form of rehabilitation, as I've got the quote here. And from Ms. Kim's presentation, you see many of the elements that are being conserved and how interpretation would take place. And just finally, in the bottom corner, in terms of the visual impact on the NCC property and on the canal, it's virtually invisible with the tree cover, but also in terms of the heights of the adjacent buildings. There's quite a step down to the south towards the German embassy, and with the tree canopy and the setback from the driveway and the canal, this will not be a very visible building. Next slide, please. So thank you very much, and I'm available to answer questions. Also, as you probably know from the speakers list, there are representatives from the client, from the architect, and from their legal counsel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we'll also take this opportunity, if there are any questions, as you had noted, from the other parts of the applicant team, we do have Councillor McKinney who have raised their hand.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I'm coming in on my phone without Wi-Fi and new headphones, so I wasn't sure. Listen, I just have one question right now. I'm not sure who can answer it from the side of the applicant, but I just want to ask about the visual accessibility of the lantern. As you know, I've not been supportive of 9 stories. I had hoped to see something more mid-rise, more in line with existing zoning come back. But in terms of the heritage attribute, so that's not what we're talking about today, but in terms of the heritage attribute and the lantern and how, I understand that, yes, of course, on a 2-story building, it wasn't visually accessible far and wide, but how far away from the building do you have to be now to be able to see it from each corner now that it's on 9 stories? I don't think you probably don't have the comparison 9 to 6, but just like to understand just how far back you have to be to see it when it's on top of 9 stories.
Well, thank you through you, Mr. Chair. I can't say exactly because the massing renderings that have been done so far give some indication of that, but I can say that at 9 stories, it's going to be above the tree cover. So it'll be quite evident, certainly from the other side of the canal. And I think even along the driveway, if you were walking, you'd be able to see it even through the tree canopy if it was lit in the evening and at night. I would direct any further questions to Mr. Anderson in terms of he's been working more closely with the massing models.
Thanks, Carl. Thank you, Councillor. In terms of the visual, how you're going to see it when you're around the building, that is part of the heritage easement, is to, in terms of how we're going to integrate it with the facade on the corner of Lewis. So the idea is to really draw your eye up towards the lantern, for it to be pretty visually accessible from anywhere along the canal, along the driveway, when you're close to that area. When you're on the other side, we haven't done extensive analysis in terms of when you're on the streets behind, depending on the tree cover and the homes on the other side. We'd have to take a further look to really kind of go around the block, see if and how it's visually prominent, depending on the context. But the idea is to make it as visually prominent as possible, and then everywhere kind of along the canal on either side, you would see it above the tree canopy.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate the response, and I guess perhaps my follow-up then, Chair, will be more to staff to talk about the easement agreement and what that means in terms of visual accessibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Vice Chair Quinn has her hand raised.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Bray. My question pertains to the moving of the wall. I mean, this project involves quite a bit of demolition and a dismantling. And I'm just wondering if you could provide a little more detail as to why the design requires the dismantling and the moving of the one facade that is going to be retained, why it could not remain in situ.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. I mentioned earlier that the current building is right in the middle of the site. So there are issues there with how you would find space around the existing building to build new structures. But as you're probably aware, with many developments that deal with heritage buildings, getting underground parking in is a major issue. So long story short, after many discussions around this issue, it was felt that by deconstructing and reconstructing in a part of the site that's closer to the corner, away from the middle, in other words, would allow the reinstating of the most important parts of the visible parts of the building, i.e. the elevation along the driveway and the lantern. And in terms of the actual process, I've been working closely not just with the architects, but also with the structural engineers and with the building contractors. And they are of the opinion, and you will see a summary in my heritage impact statement, of taking portions of the facade apart in sections, taking other portions down by hand, and reconstructing other portions. So those kind of three approaches are what are entailed. You're right, in an ideal world, it would have been preferable to try and keep those elements in situ, but for the reasons I've explained, and from what you also heard from Ms. Kim, that turned out to be virtually impossible.
Okay, thank you. I have a second question, and I may have misunderstood during your presentation, but were you saying that the fenestration of that reconstructed wall would become entranceways?
No, sorry.
You kind of, yeah, I was really kind of taken aback. I thought,
no,
I need to check this one.
I'm glad you did. Let me roll that back. What you see today is a slightly altered version of the original design. So the main entrance with that trapezoidal stair, that was the main entrance. But subsequently, a second entrance was made to what was then the kitchen coming out onto the terrace. So there are two entrances now. And so the reconstruction would, the main entrance to the new building would be through the lobby. So the reconstructed entrance might end up being, it could be functional in terms of a secondary exit, but I'll leave it to Mr. Anderson to explain a little bit more detail about that. But my reference to entrances was in terms of what's there now and how that reflected a few alterations over time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, like as Carl said, we're going to see how we can reuse the existing entrances, but the rest of the facade, all the existing windows, the original windows are now going to be facing units. So units will look out from those windows. They're going to remain functional windows.
Thank you. Those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. So if that's the case, thank you for your presentation. Much appreciated. The next registered speaker is Hunter Mcgill from Heritage Ottawa.
Good morning, Chair, and thank you very much to you and the committee for this opportunity. We have submitted I hope, useful, succinct statement of the concerns that we as Heritage Ottawa have. And I also find very useful the complimentary submission that you've received from the Strutt Foundation. I would, we've offered members of the committee, yourself, a list of questions you may wish to pose to the to city staff with regard to the mechanics of the approach that city is recommending to you. And we look forward with interest to the answers that you may get. One point that I would like to make on behalf of Heritage Ottawa is with regard to the separation of the lantern that's been described to you by both the city and by Mr. Bray. Separating it entirely from the structure, the original structure on which it was situated and of which it was an integral and important part. It seems very unfortunate that there has to be this 9-story separation of the lantern with its significance and architectural importance. As well as from the original structure, which is, as you have just been hearing, will be moved some distance on the site to permit construction of the new building. And this, we think, will, as well as making the lantern visually remote, and we're a little bit skeptical about just how visible it will be to passersby, to the public. But it also just means that that it is almost will look like an add-on to the new building, rather than seen as an important part of the original structure, which we are very anxious to see preserved to the maximum extent possible. We have used language in our submission to you, which we feel is appropriate in terms of the inventiveness, the sympathetic use of materials, and the sensitivity to the site, which we believe Mr. Strutt, a noted Ottawa architecture, used in his approach to his commission on this. I would just ask that rather than using the term brutalist, which Mr. Bray has favored, that we use the term modernist, which in fact is, I think, perhaps a more suitable term for the existing structure. I won't go any further, but of course I am very happy to try to answer any questions that you and committee members may have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for your statement and also for your submission. I don't see hands raised to ask you questions, but we are in receipt of your material, so thank you so much. The next registered speaker is Titania Truesdale of the Strutt Foundation.
I'm hoping you can hear me.
We can hear you, and you have 5 minutes.
Excellent. I apologize to everyone for the technical difficulties I'm having this morning. I'm using both phone and computer. I want to thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, for giving us a chance to speak. Most of what we have to say is said in our contact and our comments that we submitted based on the report. First, we appreciate all the efforts by city staff. I can understand how difficult this is, being in this business and dealing with heritage to start with. I think I'm not going to reboot much of what was just said by my esteemed colleagues from Heritage Ottawa. However, we firmly still believe that this property should be designated heritage, and that our problem with what is being proposed primarily is whether or not the easement can be made enforceable on a subsequent owner of the property if once the development is allowed or rezoned and the property is sold to someone else to do the actual development. When we were first approached, that was the intent, was to get the rezoning so that the property could be sold for development. We spoke to the heritage planner that was employed at that time, who, after being told about the significance of certain parts of the building, actions were taken to disassemble some of those parts, and then a new heritage planner was brought in. We're not sure why, but we do know that at that point we were then dealing with a different situation, and we feel like disassembling the building and separating the parts will take away most of its heritage value. And definitely the lantern being incorporated as a light only as opposed to an experiential space takes away most of its cultural value, and not being cohesive and interactive in the building itself, again, will detract from its value. I think I probably only wanted to say, and again, because of technical difficulties, this was on a slide, but will not be on a slide. The comment that it was made specifically for nurses and what they do can be misinterpreted as well. It is an office building. It was for the management of the association. It was for the production of their regular newsletter. And again, it was an association of women at a time when having an association, any type of association of women today on Women's Day particularly, this seems like a pretty significant building and should be recognized for that as well. There's all kinds of heritage aspects to the building that are not being addressed as far as we're concerned, primarily from our perspective, the fact that it is one of the significant buildings in the Strutt collection, as well as the Library and Archives Canada, significant buildings of the Fawn. That's all I have to say at this point. If anyone has any questions, I'm pleased to answer them. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee.
Thank you, and we appreciate your submission. I don't see any hands raised, so I don't think that there are any questions for you, but we thank you for both your statement and also for the subsequent submission that was circulated to members of the subcommittee. Now, questions for staff by the subcommittee. And I don't see, oh, I see Vice Chair Quinn has raised her hand.
Thank you. Well, I will ask Titania Truesdale's question, the Strutt Foundation's concern about the future of the easement, the implications of the easement, I should say, on future property owners. Could we have clarification on that?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Quinn. Good question. So the easement, similarly to a designation, it's a bylaw. As I mentioned in my presentation, the terms of the easement would need to be finalized and then brought back to committee for consideration before bringing forward to council for passing. And typically those bylaws are registered on title. So it would be registered for a future owner, just like a designation, and it would be enforced in perpetuity.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I see that Councillor McKinney has raised their hand.
Thank you, Chair. And just a couple of questions to staff, because I realize that they're separate. However, because we're not getting the zoning bylaw amendment and the heritage report concurrent, I have to address the 9-story height limit in vis-a-vis the lantern, because for myself, while I don't support the 9 stories, overall, the heritage attributes that are being retained, in a building that didn't have heritage protection when this all started. I believe that we've come to a place where we're seeing a significant, I don't know if improvement is the right word, from what we were faced with just 2 years ago when this all surfaced. So when we were faced with a demolition, right, like that could have been the outcome here. So we need to place that as, whether we can all agree that perhaps it should have had heritage protection, but these things are process, and here we are. So in terms of the lantern and the heritage easement agreement, you said that the heritage attributes are tied to the proposal to the site, to the development proposal to the site. Now that's coming up in days. So how does that work in terms of, when do you decide what are the heritage attributes and how they will be defined and retained? And what does that mean for, I want to go back to the lantern, for example. Does that allow the city, does it come back to us, and does that allow us to question what happens to that heritage attribute as a result of the extra height that is being sought by the applicant?
Okay, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair. So so I would say the attributes of the site have, as I mentioned in my presentation, we have used the draft statement of value, and Mr. Bray has mentioned as well, to inform the process so far, the discussions we've had so far. So I would say largely the attributes have been sort of outlined already. And really the intention would be to carry those forward into the easement terms. So listing those attributes, listing, the statement, the reasons that this property is important, why it has heritage value, as part of those terms. And that would need to come back to this committee once those have been finalized for approval. And the intention is for, so I mentioned the official plan amendment and the zoning bylaw amendment. That's running concurrently to this step now. So that will go to planning committee on Thursday together with this report. And so the intention is for staff to be able to finalize the easement terms once those approvals, once the planning approvals go forward, and sort of in that interim period, finalize those easement terms so that it can reflect the final plans for the project. I mean, as we know, some final details, get refined from the zoning stage closer to the site plan. So we want the easement to reflect those final site plan drawings and elevations and those details that eventually we'll get to that point once we have all of those details. So that would come, the easement is intended to come kind of concurrently with the site plan approval stage. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, absolutely. And could I ask then, does heritage staff take a position on the separation from the ground or from where the lantern has been located in terms of the height? Is that, do you, from a heritage perspective, do you take account of that?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think the lantern has been maybe the most challenging part in terms of being able to integrate into a new building. The scale, the height makes it a real challenge. And I think the applicant, we shared some of those concerns about, separating from the existing building. Certainly being able to keep it on top in its current location would have been the preferred approach. But, if it were to be incorporated there, it would mean, some of those units, most of those units that would look into it. So I think that's a major challenge. And certainly it's something we raised with the applicant, and they looked at different options lower than the 9th floor. They looked at that as well. But I think, having it be on the top of the new construction still speaks to some of the, its function as a beacon in the community, it potential to be lit. Those are some of the terms that we need to work out still. And like I said, how it's being integrated into the new construction, that I think still needs to be refined as well. And that'll be part of the finalizing of those easement terms and ensuring that it's visible, visible to the public, visible from the street. That will be part of those terms to be refined.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you, Chair. Just quickly in closing, I just do want to recognize from the community's efforts, staff efforts, the CNA. I know that there were many meetings, and there were times when this could have gone in a way that would not have benefited the community in any way, certainly with a full demolition of this building. This is one of those buildings that I feel has existed for so long in our neighborhood. It's almost like, I don't know, the middle of, well, I won't say how many children, but it's like you really appreciate it, but you appreciate it whenever it was just about to go off to school even more, right? Like when we were about to lose it, I mean, that's when I went around more and looked at it more often. And it certainly is tucked away and has been tucked away, which is also part of its charm, really, in a sense that it didn't glare at you every day, but it was always there. We always knew that it was there. And I agree with Mr. Hunter. Like, I think that referring to it more instead of brutalist, more as modernist, because it really is, and it's a piece of modernist architecture at a time when we were getting more slab architecture and in and around the area. So I do support the placement of the lantern. I just don't support the extra height. So I'm going to support, obviously, today the heritage report going forward. And then, my position, I don't have a position at planning from a non-planning committee, but at council then could certainly be altered depending on what happens at a planning committee. But I do want to thank everyone for their interest in this, and I do look forward to ongoing considerations around those heritage easement agreements, because we've seen just before all of this started what can happen when heritage is neglected in our community. So and not repurpose if that's what needs to happen, or not adapted into other reuses. So thank you. I appreciate everyone's work on this.
Thank you, Councillor McKinney. We definitely appreciate those insights. I see that Vice Chair Quinn has raised her hand as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I just was checking my mute. I would just like to take a moment to also express my appreciation for the amount of work that has gone into this file, this project. It has, and we know. I was sitting on this committee, on the subcommittee when it all started, and so I do know that it's been a very difficult and challenging and sensitive project, and so I do appreciate the work that has gone into it. Having said that, I would also like to echo what Councillor McKinney just said about the value of these sometimes somewhat understated modernist buildings in our community. It's very easy to undervalue them. And in fact, we're losing them more and more. And I think that this kind of heritage conservation is probably, the least desirable, when we have partial demolition, dismantling and reconstruction, and separation of key heritage elements from the building. It's taking the limbs apart and having them on display. And really the beauty of that lantern was the experience from inside the building. There was a very sophisticated design there that we haven't really even talked about today. But and James Strutt, he's a very important modernist architect in this city. And I think we need to be celebrating his work. I think this is a red flag for us. We need to be more proactive in finding other good examples of Strutt's designs in the city and getting ahead of these kinds of situations. So it is disappointing, but on the other hand, I certainly recognize the challenges and the effort that has been made to find a solution that is something more positive than a full-on demolition. But I wanted to go on record as having expressed my disappointment at the loss of the dismantling of this building, and of course, feeling a little bit like we're putting the cart before the horse by going ahead with this before determining exactly what heritage elements the easement is going to protect, sort of after we've kind of dismantled it. But anyway, I will be somewhat reluctantly approving the voting in approval of this today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Appreciate those comments, Vice Chair. And I saw that Member Podolsky had raised his hand and it seemed to have dropped down. So I don't know if you have any comments, Barry, before we wrap up.
Yes, Chair. I was waiting for the appropriate time. By the way, how is my volume? I hope I've corrected it. I can be heard.
Well, I can hear you, but others were reporting that they couldn't, so I don't know. But I always turn up the volume extremely high.
Well, I hope that I can be heard. I'll have to work on my sound system after this meeting. But I just wanted to have a few comments that I wanted to make in the comment section before we vote on this application. I'm going to support the application. Like Carolyn, I have a few reservations, but that's not going to alter my support of the staff report. My comments are as follows. One is that I knew Jim Strutt and was a colleague and friend of his for over 45 years. And this particular building is one that I did admire. I think that it is worth noting that, as Carolyn said, it's understated and in fact is one of the more conservative pieces of his works, many of which were very, very adventurous and avant-garde. Having said that, I think that I also do support the strategy that has been advocated by the staff, heritage staff planners, of an easement. This is an effective way of doing it. I do also have a little bit of concern with the separation of the head from the arms, so to speak, that put the lantern in a prominent location along the canal, but doesn't really provide it the context that it had with the arms and shoulders and base of the 2- and 3-story building. Having said that, I think that this is probably a comment that is appropriate at this time, and that is that in determining the designation and the heritage values of the Canadian Nurses Association building, where we are in the whole program of looking at the mid-century modern portfolio of buildings constructed, between the Second World War and the 1970s, there are literally hundreds, perhaps even thousands of buildings that need to be evaluated. And the step that we're taking, an ad hoc step of looking at the heritage values and the attributes of this particular building, is not being done in context of the whole portfolio of modern buildings that should be examined. This is something that we've talked about before in the Built Heritage Subcommittee. It is a task that has been agreed to be undertaken by heritage staff when funds become available to do the survey and analysis of the buildings that were built post-war to our, the late 1970s. So having said that, it's just a reminder that we should be undertaking this survey of the modernist portfolio more aggressively. That means supporting funding for heritage staff resources at City Council, so that we don't get into this one-by-one ad hoc discussions over the incorporation of building or its conservation as we are today. So with that, I will also reconfirm that I will support the staff report. Thank you very much for hearing me, and I hope that I have been heard. Thank you very much.
Well, I at least have heard you. I hope my other colleagues have. Your comments are always very insightful and learned, so we appreciate them. And I must agree with all three of my colleagues who just previously spoke. This is bittersweet. I think ideally when we see some level of designation, we are interested in adaptive reuse. We're not interested in a sense, playing Lego with buildings, deconstructing them and putting elements in different places. But I also acknowledge that this file has been challenging. We want to ensure that heritage attributes are just generally protected. and the use of a heritage easement might assist in that task. I know in terms of the correspondence we received from Heritage Ottawa, there was a question around asking, I guess, staff for an explanation as to whether this was the only option available for the former Nurses Association headquarters. I think that was somewhat addressed by Councillor McKinney's line of inquiry, but despite the fact that I will be supporting this, and like I said, I think it's bittersweet for everyone. I will ask the follow-up question before we do so, before we hold the vote, because I think it's explanatory, and I know that staff did obviously touch on it, but I think it's probably a good way to leave this debate and deliberation. Heritage Ottawa asked, what is being protected by the heritage easement? So I'm just wondering if staff could reiterate what is actually going to be protected here.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, and I did mention it a little bit in my presentation, but just to kind of mention again, really this easement is going to identify through a bylaw the important attributes of the property. It's going to require, in connection with the rezoning application, the implementation of the conservation approach that has been outlined through the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement. It's going to identify some of those opportunities that Mr. Bray mentioned, and I think some others, for interpretation, to highlight some of those previously untold stories that the site represents, and then ultimately tie this easement to the plans for the development as this project moves forward to site plan.
No, I appreciate that clarification before we move ahead with the vote. The Heritage Ottawa wanted, I think, a little bit of clarification on what this means, and I think that you've clearly stated that. I don't see anybody else with their hands raised for either further questions or comment on this item. So is this report carried?
Carried, yes.
Carried. Thank you. So this report is scheduled to be presented to Planning Committee on March 10th. In terms of the other items on the agenda, there are no in-camera items, there are no notices of motions, and we have not received any inquiries to date. Is there any other business? Seeing none, on adjournment, is the motion carried? Excellent. We're adjourned. So thank you, everyone. And our next regular meeting will be held on April 12th, 2022. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.